My father, father of living Hebrew, as told by Dola Ben Yehuda Wittmann. As you hear the recording, listen particularly for the following. 1. How old was Paula when she fell in love with Ben Yehuda? 2. How did the Jews of Jerusalem act towards Ben Yehuda? 3. How was mail handled in Jerusalem in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries? 4. How was Hebrew finally recognized officially in Palestine? Here to introduce the recording is Dr. Samuel J. Citron.
Hebrew, which for many centuries was mainly Lashon Kodesh, the sacred tongue, the language of prayer and of literature, is now a living language, the language of everyday speech both in Israel and elsewhere. If one man can be credited with this revival of Hebrew more than any others, it would be Eliezer Perlman, who changed his name to Eliezer Ben Yehuda, established one of the first, and perhaps the first all-Hebrew-speaking family in modern times, and is now generally recognized as the father of modern Hebrew. His youngest daughter, Dola Ben Yehuda Wittmann, tells us about her father, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, as she remembers him. She also tells us what it was like for the children of Eliezer Ben Yehuda in that pioneering home.
I'll try and give you a little sketch of the life of the children of Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Eliezer Ben Yehuda arrived in Jerusalem in 1881 with his wife Deborah. She didn't know any Hebrew, and he decided that he was going to found the first Hebrew-speaking family since the diaspora. So when the first child was born, he ordered his wife, Deborah, not to say a single word in any language but Hebrew, which of course she didn't know, not very much. And this he had to follow. The first child was born in 1882, and strange to say, he had difficulty in speaking until he was 3 years old. The people who were against the revival of the Hebrew language thought that the reason was because it is an old biblical language and he would never be able to speak, and therefore he would remain and be an idiot. But Eliezer Ben Yehuda said he will try again and again until the Hebrew language becomes a spoken language. Eliezer Ben Yehuda asked his wife never to talk or to mention or to sing a song not in Hebrew. And one day he caught Deborah singing a little Russian lullaby. He became infuriated and scolded her in front of Ben-Zion, who was 3. Ben-Zion was terrified by the anger of Eliezer Ben Yehuda, of his father, and all of a sudden he screamed out and he said, "Abba, Ima Tova, Daddy, Mother is good." This was the first sentence that he spoke in Hebrew, and since then he was able to speak. As a child of 3, he didn't have any children to play with because Eliezer Ben Yehuda refused to let the boy hear any other language but Hebrew. And since there were no people who spoke Hebrew at the time in Israel, in Palestine, of the Turkish period, he was not allowed to speak with any children. Outside of the family, his father and mother and his only friends were a cat, a dog, and a snake, to whom he could say what he wanted and speak to them from time to time. However, in time there were more children in the house, and that became actually the first Hebrew-speaking family since the diaspora, since 2,000 years ago. My father's idea of the revival of the Hebrew language did not start in Palestine. It started actually in Europe shortly after he was a Bahur Yeshiva, or a Yeshiva Bocher, as one calls it here, in a little village in Russia, where he was studying Talmud and Tanakh and all the religious books. And shortly afterwards, he has dreamt and thought of the revival of the Hebrew language, so that the story of our family, of the birth of the children, began in Jerusalem, but the story of the revival began really in his mind in 1879 in Paris. But we have to go back even before that. Eliezer was thrown out of his uncle's house when he was 14 years old, because his uncle found him reading a secular book, not a religious book. And he roamed through the streets in Russia during the night until he saw a synagogue. He went to the synagogue and he just had time enough to get there, hungry and poor, and he slept. The next day in the morning, a very nice man came to the synagogue to pray and saw Eliezer and asked him what he was doing, and he told him the whole story. Thereupon this man said, "Come with me home, we have a big family, and you will be just one more in the family." So he took Eliezer to their home, and the first thing to do was to give him something to eat and drink and wash, and then to introduce him to the rest of the children, among whom were two daughters. One was Deborah, she was 17 years old, and the other was Paula, who was 2 years old. Afterwards, Deborah was to teach Eliezer Russian in order that he should be able to go to the gymnasium, to the high school. She taught him Russian and French. At the same time that she was teaching him, Paula, her little sister of 2, used to sit in the corner and watch Deborah teach him, and particularly watch Eliezer while he was being taught. And strange to say, both Deborah and Paula both fell in love with Eliezer. Deborah married Eliezer. 10 years after the arrival in Jerusalem, Deborah caught the consumption from Eliezer Ben Yehuda and died. When Deborah was lying in the hospital, she wrote a letter to her sister Paula. And she wrote to her and she wanted to tell her that if anything happens to her, she should marry Eliezer. Because if she marries Eliezer, she will be a queen. However, she died before she was able to finish the last sentence, and the only thing that Paula received was a letter from her saying, "If I die," but they all understood very well what she meant. There remained 5 little orphans, 3 of whom followed her to the grave and passed away too. So now Eliezer remained with just only Ben-Zion, the oldest son, and Yemima, the second one, and things looked very gloomy and very unhappy. At that time, the sister of Deborah, who was a young, beautiful girl, about 19 years old, wrote to Eliezer and said that she wants to come and take over the family, become his wife, become the second Mrs. Ben Yehuda. The doctors forbade Eliezer Ben Yehuda to even think of marrying her sister. The doctor claimed that it was enough that she contracted the consumption from him, and they did not feel, the doctor and the friends of Eliezer Ben Yehuda, that he had a right even to think of marrying another sister who would probably also be a victim through the tuberculosis consumption which she might get just like her sister. And therefore the doctor bade my father, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, to write to Pola. After this letter, she sent a cable and she said she was coming in spite and against the doctor's advice. She came and she revived not only the language together with Eliezer Ben Yehuda, but the whole family. And the family of Eliezer Ben Yehuda became a very well-known family where most of the important people from all over the world gathered and were interested to see how he revived the Hebrew language. Pola took the Hebrew name Hemda, which means désiré, cherished, gave Eliezer another 6 children, and so Eliezer Ben Yehuda had a little army of his own to fight his way through with the Hebrew language. I happened to be one of this family, the youngest girl, the youngest child in the family. We had a great difficulty to go around. Nobody wanted to speak to us. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with us. In fact, they made a herem, a ban on Eliezer Ben Yehuda and his family, and refused to have anything to do with the family. The reason for it was that he wanted to introduce Hebrew as a spoken language and had already a family to show off that it can be done, whereas the Orthodox people of Palestine at that time refused to recognize Hebrew as a spoken language because as far as they were concerned, Hebrew was to be spoken only in the synagogue with God and in prayers and not as a regular vernacular of the Jewish people. Gradually, the family grew, and by that time, when there were already 5 children of Hemda, who is my mother, and the 2 children of Deborah, Eliezer Ben Yehuda became more sure of what he was doing, had confidence in the work that he was doing, and slowly and gradually other people in Palestine began talking Hebrew too. We actually, all the children, formed a little army, private army of Eliezer Ben Yehuda, and every one of us had his job to propagate, to fight, to make people speak the language and understand us. And I remember very well, since my father never allowed us to use any foreign words and had to create and invent Hebrew words so that we can use them in everyday life, I remember that very often walking in the streets or going to a store and using the Hebrew words that we learned at home from my father, people didn't understand what we were saying and mocked us, saying, "This is not Hebrew, this is not the language, this is the language of Eliezer Ben Yehuda, this is Ben Yehudke Hebrew." And so we grew, and the language became more and more popular. Life in Jerusalem was at that time very sad, particularly for children. There were no trees, sanitation was very poor, there were no parks, children had no place to go to. It was really a miserable life, and the Arabs all around with their sick eyes and all the Oriental and diseases of the Near East, it was really a very difficult thing to bring up a family there. But Ben Yehuda insisted that even if he has to sacrifice a few of them, and he did, 6 of his children died on the altar of the Hebrew language, he was happy that he was able to do it. One of our little pleasures was, and there were very few, that on Friday, when Eliezer Ben Yehuda and my mother Hemda went to the various post offices to get the mail, during the Turkish Empire, every nation had its own post office. We were little tots, and we were allowed to go with them from post office to post office and then go and have some tea or beer or ice cream or whatever we desired. This was one of our great joy. Otherwise, as I said before, it was not easy. Later on, as it was recognized, and when people began speaking Hebrew, we had more friends. There were by that time already schools where they taught Hebrew, and we became a little bit more accepted in the not in the society of Jerusalem, but in life in Jerusalem. And those people who were against us and who boycotted us and who made a herem, a ban on us, had to accept Ben Yehuda's language, the Hebrew language, which in time, as you know, has become the national language of the Jewish people of the Jewish state of Israel. It was in 1920, after a year that the British came to Palestine and took over the mandate, that the British government of Palestine recognized Hebrew as one of the three official languages: English, Arabic, and Hebrew. This was the victory of Eliezer Ben Yehuda and the beginning of the Jewish state.
Now that you heard the recording, it might be a good idea to discuss it. Here are some suggested topics for discussion. 1. Why was Eliezer Ben Yehuda justified in his struggle to make Hebrew the spoken language in the land of Israel? 2. What should be the role of Hebrew in America? Should all Jews learn Hebrew? Why? Should it become a home language to be spoken by Jews in their houses? 3. In recent times, there have been two notable attempts to revive old languages to make them the language of everyday speech: Hebrew in Israel and Gaelic in Ireland. Why has the effort on behalf of Hebrew been a complete success, while Gaelic is still not the universal spoken language of Ireland?